All right, welcome everyone. Sorry we're starting a little bit later. So we are here to talk about anxiety. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that too loud? I feel like I'm really loud, but I never talk loud. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Jonathan Rauwerda. I'm a behavior analyst. I have my own consulting firm. I work with kids pretty much age 3 to adults 91. So my oldest adult right now is 76. He just turned 76. Also, I do a little bit of work for Timothy across the road, Timothy Christian School. So if I have any kids, I don't have too many kids in here today, but for those of you I do have, you might see me around Timothy. So we're going to talk about, we're going to get into it because I know everyone's time is valuable. But before we can get into talking about anxiety with others, it's important to kind of know what is anxiety, right? So if you Google it, go on social media, right, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And so I just kind of wanted to give you guys the baseline of what psychology says anxiety is. So anxiety is a mental condition characterized by excessive apprehensiveness about real or perceived threats, typically leading to avoidance behaviors and often to physical symptoms such as increased heart rate and muscle tension. Oh, I didn't change, sorry, my bad. Got to get used to the double. So anxiety is a mental health diagnosis. It's no different than cancer. Yes, maybe it doesn't have the same biological makeup, but similar to cancer, we often only see the external signs or behaviors, but don't see the actual disease itself. So yet, we often feel more comfortable talking about a cancer diagnosis than we do a mental health diagnosis, right? I would say most people feel more comfortable talking about physical ailments than they do about mental health things going on. So one thing to know what anxiety is not. So anxiety is not a sin. Anxiety is God-given in the sense that a healthy amount of anxiety can keep us safe. Anxiety does not make a person less of a human being, just as cancer doesn't make someone less of a person, right? What I'm trying to say is that we should be just as comfortable talking about mental health diagnosis as we are about bodily health diagnosis. Make sense? Yeah? Everyone tracking? Okay. It feels a lot bigger this time. Last time I was in a small, cramped room, so I was getting a lot of interaction, which I love, but that's all right. We'll make do. All right, so some common signs of anxiety. So we have some physical symptoms. So I'm going to go not so exhaustive of a list, but some physical symptoms can include things like rapid or irregular heartbeats, muscle tightness, wound up or on edge, dry mouth, chest pain, sweating, shortness of breath. That all fits under physical symptoms. Okay. Sorry about that. Next, we have mental symptoms. So mental symptoms can include feelings of being out of control, feelings of panic, fear or nervousness, difficulty controlling feelings of worry, all or nothing kind of thinking. And then last but not least, we have behavioral symptoms, which is like problems falling asleep, restlessness, avoidance behaviors. Make sense? Okay. Did it switch? Good. Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about these topics that you guys can see up front here. So we talked a little bit about general. We're going to get more into that. We're going to talking about anxiety with family members, talking about anxiety with others, and talking about anxiety as if we're talking, right, sharing our anxieties with others. Okay. So we're going to get more into it. This is a broad topic that is extremely person-specific. So the information I'll be sharing today is more broad than it is specific. So please remember that some of these suggestions may be helpful for some, but not for all. Okay? The most important thing to remember, if you're going to remember anything, is that we as Christians are called to be compassionate, and we should always be compassionate when discussing anxiety or any mental health with others. Okay? All right. So just in general, when talking with others, so we have first up there, we have coming to you, okay? So these are people that maybe you come to and share, hey, I have anxiety, right? So one thing to remember is we don't want to force it, right? So oftentimes we get into that mode of somebody comes to us with a problem, and what do we want to do? We want to jump right into it, right? If somebody comes to you, they're probably a little bit nervous, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. So we don't want to force it. We want them to be comfortable talking to us, okay? So the best way to do that is to just listen. Let them process their feelings without judgment and without immediately jumping in to fix everything for them, right? Sometimes people don't want to talk about their feelings without resolving them immediately, so don't dismiss someone's worries or anxieties as a trivial or unimportant. Help them see that God cares about every one of their concerns, right? Help them think through those, what the worst case scenario might look like, and ask them how they would handle each step, right? So a lot of times we're just asking them like, okay, well, what do you think's going to happen? And is there ways that we can address these things if they do happen, right? So in my own practice, I do a lot of like role playing. So we'll go through scenarios. So I had a young man the other day who asked me, he said, I'm worried what's gonna happen if the police come to my apartment. He lives by himself. He's never gotten into trouble. I don't think he's ever going to get in trouble with the police. But he was worried about that, right? So we did some role plays. Okay, so let's pretend I'm the police. I'm knocking on the door. Let's go through a scenario, right? That scenario probably will never happen, and if it does happen, we'll probably not play out in that sense. But in that moment, I helped him start processing and thinking through those things, and you could see his anxiety, which was up here, go down to here, simply by allowing him to talk and allowing myself just to listen at that point, and then helping him process. Another good thing to do is provide validation, not solution, right? So people struggling with anxiety often feel like their feelings are wrong, unimportant, or irrational. So validate their feelings by thanking them for sharing their worries with you, affirm their bravery and vulnerability, and let them know you're there for them. Okay, people who struggle with anxiety may also feel stigma that they don't have, for example, here at church, right, enough faith, when that's not the case. So let them know that God cares for them and wants to be with them through their anxiety. That's okay to share with them, right? So we want to provide that validation, not solution, right? We're not into a problem solving. We're not saying like, here, do this. We're listening, we're validating, we're taking in what they're sharing with us. Make sense? Okay. All right. And then recognize your limitations, right? So Matthew mentioned this early on in the sermon today, right? About how we should be using worldly things, right? But looking at those worldly things and seeing if they're interfering with our faith, right? So recognizing your limitations. Maybe your role is to suggest like, hey, it sounds like you are really anxious. Maybe I can help you find a therapist, or maybe I can help you find a psychologist or a psychiatrist who can help you some more, right? So recognizing your limitations, knowing that you might not be able to fully solve their problems is a big step even just for ourselves, right? All right. Questions? No? Am I tracking okay? Okay. All right. Okay, so going to them, right? So this is where we are going to someone that we think has anxiety, right? So sometimes we notice that our loved ones appear to be suffering from anxiety before they realize it, right? Oftentimes, individuals who are anxious don't recognize when they're anxious, right? I have individuals who know they have anxiety disorders, and I will walk in and I can tell they're anxious, and they'll tell me, I feel great today. Today's a fantastic day. Meanwhile, they're not sitting still. They're moving all around the room, right? Or they're talking a mile a minute, like, how's your dog? How's your cat? What's going on today? What's the weather like out there? I haven't been outside yet today, right? They have anxiety. I can tell, right? So sometimes, even though they have this official diagnosis, they're not recognizing the anxiety in themselves in that moment. So it's okay to go to somebody and share what you're observing. So maybe going to a loved one and sharing like, hey, I've noticed that you haven't been at Bible study recently, or we used to go for breakfast and I haven't gotten a phone call or a text back that you want to go for breakfast again. Everything going on okay, right? Now, I'm not saying that you call them out and say, I think you have anxiety, but checking in is a good way, right? Share what you're observing, share what you're seeing, right? Can be really helpful versus judgmental. So like, hey, I just haven't seen you at church recently, right? Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Another piece of that is don't enable. So when going to someone, oftentimes it's common you want to help your loved one avoid painful situations by going out of your way to eliminate the cause for concern, right? So on the surface, this seems really thoughtful and sweet, but anxiety doesn't usually go away. Actually, over time, if people continually avoid facing difficult situations, anxiety grows, and special requests for accommodations get bigger. Okay? So we also don't want to enable. And then reassurance. So if your friend or a loved one is frequently asking some form of what if something terrible happens, and then looking to you for reassurance, by reassuring them, you're actually perpetrating their anxiety to an extent, right? Because what's going to happen is they're going to come to you looking for that versus facing their anxiety at that point in time. Okay? Does that all make sense? Yeah? Questions? No? Okay.
Can you give an example right in there with enabling and reassurance, like doing it right or wrong?
Yeah, I can definitely do. So enabling would be, for example, let's say your son or daughter, let's say, and I'm not calling specifically on your son or daughter, but let's say your son or daughter comes to you and says, like, I'm really anxious about this upcoming math test that I have. I'm going to fail it. It's going to be awful. I know I'm going to fail it. So the day of the math test, they wake up, they're very anxious, and you say, you know what, I'm just going to call school. You can have this whole rest of this day to study at home, and you can probably I'll just talk to your teacher, and you can take that test tomorrow, so you'll feel less anxious. And what we're doing is we're prolonging it, and we're just enabling it, because what's going to happen next is the next time they have a big test that maybe they're not as prepared for, or they're going to come to you and they're going to be like, I'm really anxious again. Do you think we can call my teacher and I'll come in tomorrow then and take it so I can study all day today, right? So what we're doing is we're just enabling it, and then that kind of leads into everything else that can seep into other areas of our lives, right? So now they have a job and we're calling their boss and asking their boss, right? Or those kinds of things. Is that answer for enabling? Yeah, so in a healthy way to reassure that, I mean, what you would do is you would listen to them, validate their feelings, and then ask them, well, what do you think we should do at this point, right? And obviously, if they're saying, I don't know what to do at this point, then maybe that's when we're giving solutions, but we really don't want to give a lot of solutions, right? I would say that you'd probably have to then think about, okay, so if they're very anxious about this test, how can we help them feel less anxious in the future? So whether it's like we're scheduling times to sit with your son or daughter and scheduling out those times to study, asking them ahead of time, okay, so let's start scheduling out when your tests are so we know we can start studying, we can set aside an hour a day. And what we're trying to work on is those skills, right, to reduce that anxiety over time and help them feel more prepared, because a lot of times when it comes to anxiety too, we're not as prepared as we feel we are, and that's what makes us anxious, right? Like if I came in today and Matthew said to me, hey, John, tonight you're going to be doing the sermon along with a Q&A, I'd be like an anxious mess, right? I had no time to prepare. I'm not in that mindset at that point in time. So, make sense? Okay. And like I said, today's more of a general overview because everybody's so different, and what I might use with or work with somebody on is going to be different than what I'm going to use or work with somebody else on. There might still be the same basic principles like we're talking about today, but I'm going to tailor it, or you can tailor it based on the individual, right? Okay? All right. All right, so we're going to talk about family members here. So when talking about anxiety with family members, it's a lot different, right? We have that connection with them. They're not a stranger. It's not somebody at church who I know we all love each other and we all know each other, but it's a different connection when it's your own family, right? So we're going to just go through some ways that you can approach them, help them. The first being set aside time to be available and approachable. So oftentimes the best thing we can provide is uninterrupted time. We all have busy lives, so making the time each day and sharing with the person can be helpful, right? So setting that time aside, but also recognizing that just because you set aside 5 to 5:30 as the time that you want to discuss, they may not be interested in talking at that time, right? That might not be enough time, right? So I'm not saying set a specific, like every day at 5 to 5:30 we're going to discuss, or we can sit down and we can chat, but giving them that opportunity, like, hey, like I've got nothing going on from 6 to 8, so if you want to chat or you want to sit down, go through some things that are maybe making you anxious, right? Taking that time, giving them that time, and if they take it, great. If they don't take it, we're not forcing it upon them, okay? We want to be empathetic. So often we get into therapist mode and we want to just solve, right? So that's a big theme here is we often like hear people's problems and we want to solve them, right? But that's not our role. Our role is to emphasize, I can't speak today. So you can offer to help problem solve, but it shouldn't be your go-to, right? Really just listening. For a lot of individuals, that's what they want. They want somebody who is sitting there and listening. For a lot of our family members, right, they're coming to us because they need to share with somebody, right? And so they feel safe enough to share with you. So you shouldn't go right into that problem-solving mode. Does it make sense? Yes?
Sometimes
Yeah.
when I listen to someone, I'll say, do you want me to just listen, or do you want me to help you figure it out?
Yeah, that's a
So
good one.
that they can express what they want.
Yeah.
And you can listen with the appropriate time.
Good. Yeah, I like that. Thanks. Don't force it. So as parents, we know when our child is anxious about things, and we may rush to ask them how their test went, right? This often can turn our kids off, or as a result, lead to selective mutism, as I like to say, right? It can also make somebody more anxious, right? So if you know that they're anxious about this thing and they finish that interview that maybe they were anxious about, and you called them immediately afterwards and you're like, how'd your interview go, right? That's not going to help their anxiety at that point, right? You can call them and just say like, hey, how are you doing, right? How are things, right? That's fine, but jumping right into those things that are going to make them anxious is probably just going to make them anxious again. So let them come to you. Or just making general questions like Janice said, like, I'm here to listen if you want to talk about it, but if not, that's okay too, right? Or do you want me to help you problem solve? So say this, not that. So don't say when we're talking to loved ones, and we all have a tendency of doing this, right? Stop worrying, right? Rather say, tell me your worries, right? Oftentimes what we want to do is we want to not tell them to not worry, but we want to ask them to tell us their worries, right? Open that door, not shut that door. It's all in your head, right? What would be a good one for that? Any suggestions? What's going on in your head, right? I think that is oftentimes what a lot of times I have to ask individuals that I'm working with. I'm not saying it's all in your head, rather I'm saying, what's going on in your head? Tell me your thoughts, right? Snap out of it, right? We don't want to say that. Rather, we want to say, tell me more, right? Don't be so dramatic. Rather say, tell me why this is bothering you, right? You just need to relax and calm down. Rather say, would it be helpful for us to do a breathing activity together? Does that make sense? Okay. We also have do coping skills with them. This can be a really helpful one when working with family members. So offer to do coping skills with them. Coping skills, if you were at my last presentation that I did, coping skills are a good way to manage your anxiety, but it takes a lot of work. So you have to engage in coping skills daily. Because you're not going to be able to just utilize a coping skill when you're feeling anxious. It might help a little bit, but if you want long-term, you should be practicing coping skills daily. So you should be setting time aside daily to do some breathing exercises, to do whatever coping skill that you like to do, because then when you're in that moment, that's where you're automatically going to go to. You're going to go to the coping skill versus those other behaviors that you engage in, those avoidant behaviors that don't help the anxiety. So what we want to do is we want to work on coping skills. So I always say family members or parents can help with that. So maybe it's like, hey, I was thinking of doing some breathing exercises. Let's do some breathing exercises. Or, hey, I just got a new coloring journal, and I know that you like to use your coloring journal. Let's use our coloring journal together. Like, I want to color right now. Do you want to color with me, right? Those kinds of things. And then offer to help develop a plan. So sometimes people don't know what to do. So throwing suggestions at them isn't helpful, but offering to help them problem solve or develop a plan, we want them to feel included, right? Not telling them, do this. Make sense? Okay. Questions? Okay. Yes?
I find that it's helpful to point out reminders of when they were nervous or when they were anxious about certain things, and then remind them how that turned out. Like if they, like for instance, like a test.
Yeah.
They're nervous about a test. And if you remind them, like, remember last week you were nervous about this test and you did fine, and it worked out good. Is that good to remind them of times that they were nervous or anxious about things and they ended up turning out better than they thought?
If they are calm, yeah. If they're anxious, absolutely not. Yeah. But that's a good question. I mean, that is what we do, we tend to do, right? We're like, oh, well, you just took 20 tests already this year, and you got A's on all of them, and pointing that out in that moment of anxiety is just not that helpful. Our brain goes into that fight or flight mode, right? So we're probably going into flight mode when we're feeling that anxious, and so we're not thinking about past prior experiences. Now, if they're sitting there watching TV and you're like, hey, like, how's your day going? And then, great job last week on that test, you were really nervous about it, and like, look, you got an A on it. That's fantastic. Like, look how good you did. Is going to have more of an impact than in that moment. In that moment, what you want to do is just listen to them, let them share, and then ask them, like, do you want me just to keep listening to you, or do you want me to, like, should we try to problem solve this, and make them part of that process, right? And maybe you are doing a little bit more of the problem solving, because maybe you're saying, like, well, if I were to take a test, maybe I would, like, make an outline of what's going to be on the test. And they might say to you, nah, I can't do that. That's not going to be helpful, right? I don't even know where I'd start. That's where you could say, well, could I help you start it then, at least, right? And so that would be a better approach, but you can definitely, I think you should refer them back to areas. And individuals that I typically meet with, I do. So if they're in a good, calm space, I'm pointing out, like, look how, like, you were so anxious about that job interview, and look, you've been at this job now for a month and a half and doing fantastic. Your supervisor just told you you're getting a raise. Like, that's amazing, right? So, because oftentimes we forget about those anxiety moments, but when we're anxious, we don't want to be reminded of more anxiety. So, makes sense? Yes?
At what point can you say, let's pray about that, I'll pray with you about it?
So you, after listening, I I would always offer to pray for them. Yeah. And if they're interested, yeah. If they're not interested, let it be. I've seen, there's a podcast that I enjoy. He's a Christian therapist. And he said it used to really irk him when people would come and people knew he was Christian. They would come into his practice and he'd be like, at the end of each session, like, well, let me pray for you. And he's like, some people would tell him no, and he'd be so irked about it because he's like, they're just not good enough believers to think. But that's not the case, right? Sometimes people are just still somewhat anxious. And praying, though very similar to like meditation, which is a great coping skill, but just like any coping skill, right? Prayer takes practice, right? We are not good prayers until we've been praying a lot. Right? And so some individuals just, they don't feel so comfortable praying. But I would always offer it, like, hey, would it be okay if I prayed for you? And for some individuals, it's really helpful, and for other individuals, not so much. They're just not interested in it. And you don't want to force things upon somebody who's already feeling anxious, or who was anxious and now is feeling better, and now making them anxious because you're saying, let me pray for you, right? But you can definitely always ask. I always think it's really helpful. I know I find reassurance when I feel anxious and somebody says to me, like, can I bring your concerns to God? And I appreciate that. And if they offer to pray with me, great. And if they don't, at least I know somebody's praying for me, right? Okay.
Along those same lines, even in the math test example, as Christians, where do you bring God's perspective into, the biblical perspective into, into a situation? Do you bring God's word into it?
So you can bring God's word into it, and I think that's a struggle with for any Christian psychologist. Now, if you are part of a practice, let's say, that is Christian, and you announce that you're Christian to the world.
Like the math test situation where it's a Christian and Christian.
Okay. Yeah, I think giving the reassurance. So, like, if you're looking at like these that I said here, when we're being empathetic, right? You could offer to pray for them, right? You can bring it into there. Doing coping skills, like I said, prayer can be really helpful. So, like, hey, I know you have this big test coming up in 2 weeks. Can I pray with you about it? Right? Bringing it up then. They could be anxious. You could bring it up then too. But what I'm trying to share is, like, if they're telling you no, that's probably not what they're needing or is going to be helpful for them in that moment. So then on your own, you can go and pray for them. Does that make sense? So then, like, letting them know, like, I'll go pray for you. So I'm not saying...
More bringing into the conversation what the Bible says about the math test.
Mm-hmm.
Bring the biblical perspective into it.
So I think that would be a person-by-person based decision. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't do that, but I think it will depend upon the individual who you're working with.
Examples from the Bible, like say when David was anxious about certain situations.
Yeah, you could bring it into there at that point in time too. Definitely, for sure. Yeah. Sorry, I feel like I'm not really answering your question because I keep giving you examples and you're like, no. I think it's really specific, right? If you're talking about, I don't know, maybe they are talking about a math exam, for example, then yes, going to the Bible and being like, here, but I also think you have to be in that listening mode versus that some people might take, I'm going to start throwing Bible stuff at you, as not being empathetic or listening. And you have to remember, when we're in the fight or flight mode, we're not taking in a lot of things into our brain at that point in time, if that makes sense. But in the coping skill area, so when we're calm and we're doing things that kind of help us keep our anxiety lower, definitely working into the conversation, things from the Bible that talk about anxiety. And anxiety's in the Bible a lot. There are so many examples. You could even, I wouldn't suggest sharing with somebody if they came up to you and said, I have the worst anxiety in the world, and this is why, right? unless they're calm, but you could use like the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Where Jesus was anxious about being crucified. I mean, there's versions that state he was sweating blood. I mean, that's a massive amount of anxiety to have. I get it. I would be anxious too at that point. But working that into there, I think you have to pick and choose your moments at that point and be aware. Does that answer your questions a little bit more? Yeah.
Are you pointing to the sovereignty of God? That God,
Yeah.
like you say, you have to do all the things, you have to study, you have to work at it, but ultimately, we have to trust that God is in control.
Right.
And we trust in his providence.
Yeah. But that's easier said than done, right? And I think you would agree. Yeah, it's extremely difficult. And I think this goes back even to Matthew's sermon today of the Bible doesn't tell us we shouldn't engage in worldly things, right? Unless it's inhibiting us from the sovereignty of God, right? So that's where I think you have to find a good blend of that to help. Yeah? Yes?
In regards to a child from 13 to an adult child,
Yeah.
53,
Mm-hmm.
and he or she is having difficulties, they're acting, it's off.
Mm-hmm.
To physically embrace your child and say, I know you're suffering. I can see that things aren't right. Can I help you with physical embrace and being next to them? Do you benefit?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the person, right? So some individuals, when feeling anxious, do not want to be touched, and some individuals will love that. But I think offering it, and I think the way you worded it was beautiful. That's exactly the right approach to it. Like, is it okay if I give you a hug right now?
Yes, the closeness would be, you can calm them down because affection does affect the person, the person itself.
Right.
You can bring them off the edge.
Yeah, and like I said, but I think it's person dependent too. There's others individuals who, if you were to approach them and say, I'm going to give you a hug, or you just gave them a hug, their sense of heightenedness and that want to run, they might be like, leave me alone. And you might see an increase in other behaviors.
But if you persist of showing love and affection,
Mm-hmm.
well, it does mellow the mind.
It can, yeah, if we're calm and we're in that right state of mind, right? So it's all person dependent, and that's why I'm saying this is a broad overview. If you're looking at, I'll talk to myself. So my wife's sitting up here, and she can attest to this. When I am very anxious or like stressed out, I do not like hugs. Do not come and hug. And she'll persist and give me hugs, and I'm like, I don't want a hug right now. Like, I feel like I want to, like, I need to go do something else at that point in time. So I'm not disagreeing with you, because I do think that there's a place and there's a time, but for some individuals, and I know I'm not alone, because I know of individuals who also do not enjoy that physical touch at that point in time. But I'm not saying that you can't do it, and I'm saying, like, yes, if I'm calm, give me all the hugs in the world, for sure. Absolutely, I love it. But I think it's really person dependent, and I think you can't say, there actually was a therapy called hug therapy back in the day, and their solution was like, you give somebody a hug every 15 minutes and it's going to make them better, and the research did not correlate with it at all. There was just not a lot of people. Some people did work well. I'm not going to say it didn't work well at all for anybody. For a couple people, it did work well. But if you look at the research, a lot of I'd say like 90% of the participants in these studies, it just was not a helpful thing for them. Yeah.
I'm not going to spend 4 hours prepping for Thanksgiving dinner.
Okay.
I'm anxious.
Okay. So what are you asking me here?
I'm just making a statement.
Okay. So yes, and that might happen, right? But then that's where, like, you as a family member can offer to, hey, can I help you with Thanksgiving dinner, right? Or you can offer to, maybe you're saying, hey, instead of you hosting this year, why don't I host this year, right? I can take some of that off. Is that okay with you? Or ask them, well, what do you need? What do you need help with? What about Thanksgiving dinner is making you so anxious? How can I help you, right? That's going to be responded to much better, right? And hopefully you guys can come up with a game plan and you can do that. Okay. Yes, I saw that. Any other questions? No? Okay. So talking about anxiety with others, so whether this is friends, students, coworkers, right? So first, what you want to do is you want to thank them. So this is probably one of the easiest things to do, and yet one that we often forget, right? Because we go right into problem-solving mode, right? But what we need to remember is it does take a lot for people to come and share that they're anxious, right? Look at me. I'm presenting on anxiety, and the hug question, I finally was like, I'll just share about myself. But that took me even a little bit to present that to you, right? So I always think it's really helpful to just thank someone for sharing, right? It's extremely validating, right? We get a lot of reinforcement when somebody shares, like, thanks for sharing that with me. That must have been hard, right? That's really validating because we've put all this time and energy to share, and right? And then the response back is, oh, well, that's dumb, right? Isn't very helpful, right? So we want to make sure that we're thanking them, right? Listening. So once again, I get back into listening because this is really the key components, right? It's always better to listen. Often we want to give suggestions, solve their problems, but we can't fix anyone, nor should we try. So we're all mutually broken and all in desperate need, of God's redeeming grace. So don't try to resolve all their anxiety. When you offer solutions to everything, people may feel guilty if their feelings don't immediately change, right? Instead, let them know you're there to help and you're here to listen, and listening is one of the best ways to show love. Right? Listening involves our time, and what's most valuable, right? Some people might say money is the most valuable thing you have. It's not, it's time, right? You ask anybody who, as we start to get older, I'm starting to get older, what's the most valuable thing of mine is time, right? I always say, if I only had more time. I don't think I've ever said, if I only had more money, right? It's always time. Time is valuable, so giving people your time, listening, is just extremely valuable. Ask them what they need. So we've kind of been talking about this, and a lot of this is similar throughout because these are things that we should be doing if we're trying to work with somebody who has anxiety, right? So ask them what they're learning through their anxiety can be helpful. Often reflecting on what we're learning from anxiety can be helpful in helping us better manage our anxiety. This can include asking them what they need, right? So, or do things together, right? So invite them places, visit and simply sit in silence, watch a movie, read the Bible together, right? Oftentimes we want to solve people's problems, but sometimes it's just spending time with them when they're feeling anxious. So if you have a coworker who comes to you and says like, hey, I'm just super anxious about this project, inviting them to, I don't know, go grab coffee after work one day or something like that, right? A lot of times that can just be extremely helpful. And then, of course, encourage them, right? So let them know that God cares for them and wants to be with them through their anxiety. Similar to the previous point, don't miss their anxious feelings, but don't make them feel like they don't have enough faith either, right? That should never be the goal, but our goal, we can encourage them. We can offer to pray for them. We can share that God does care about them, right? Oftentimes when we are feeling anxious or we're feeling troubled, right, we forget that God cares about us. So giving them that friendly reminder can be extremely helpful and validating. So, questions? Keep going? I know yes?
I know for some people, when they're anxious, they talk more, they get more active.
Yeah.
If you have someone who their anxiety is causing them to kind of shut down,
Yeah.
are there ways to help them access, like, what they might be feeling, if they're just like, you can't get, when you want to listen or you want to be like, what's going through your head, and they don't really know, what are the steps we can take to help them open that up?
Yeah, and once again, this is like person dependent too, right? Because everyone's going to respond a little bit differently. But there are steps that you can take. So it might take like offering to do something with them that has nothing to relate to it, right? So I have worked with individuals where they'll tell me, I don't know what's causing my anxiety, I don't know what's doing it. So we'll go for a walk. I'll be like, well, let's just go for a walk then. We don't have to even talk, we'll just go for a walk, right? And as we're walking, all of a sudden they're saying to me like, actually, I'm really anxious because next week my sister's having everybody from the family over. She asked me to bring dessert, and I'm horrible at picking things for people to eat, right? Now we just open up that conversation versus like me trying to force that conversation. So sometimes just doing things outside of that conversation. It could be reading the Bible, right? So it could be like, all right, well, do you mind if can we do a Bible study together, right? So now we're just kind of maybe changing the topic a little bit, but maybe that will help bring up what they're anxious about or feeling at that time. A lot of times we don't recognize, right, what our anxiety is about until we actually sit down and think, but it's really hard to think when you're anxious. So sometimes doing something else can help get us to that point. Yes?
So, when you mentioned going and walking with someone, sometimes the physical component of it, of not being face to face. So, breaking that component of it and just spending time with them, and they're not face to face with you,
Right.
does open up that door.
Yeah.
So, I've heard let's just go for a drive. I know ski lifts are wonderful places to open up because you're not facing one another.
Yeah.
Which can be kind of threatening or just not comfortable for some people.
Yeah.
So it gives them the sense that they're going alongside of you as opposed to
Right.
you're feeling down.
Yeah. Oddly enough, watching a movie or TV with somebody can also be a good one to do. In the same concept of you're usually sitting next to each other, right? Or someone's sitting here and you're sitting here. Can just be really helpful. I had a family member who I would go visit every once in a while, and all we do is watch TV, and I learned more about their anxiety from watching TV with them, usually a hockey game, versus going out for coffee with them, where they would say oh, I'm anxious, but that would be the end of the conversation. They'd put a stop to it and it would be done. So definitely, yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. Anyone else? Okay. All right. So some other ways to support, check in, but don't constantly ask if they're okay, right? So just check in hey, how's your day going today, right? But you're not asking how's your anxiety? What do you rate your anxiety at today, right? We're not all therapists. Some of us are, but we're not asking them to rate their anxiety, right? We're just checking in and just asking if they're okay. Give space and support. So many people with anxiety find that they need the most help when they want to push everyone away. So if they're alone in the room, it may help to sit quietly with them, giving them some space, right? But you're sitting there with them. So we're not forcing them to communicate with us, but rather maybe we've noticed, hey, they've been up in their room for the last 4 hours. That's usually not like them, just going up there and being hey, just thought I would come out and hang out with you. Is that okay with you? Or can I sit in here and play some Candy Crush, right? For some individuals, that can just be really helpful. Give reassurance. So people with anxiety constantly doubt that others care about them, so make sure to reassure them that you care about them and that they are not a nuisance or a burden, right? So even if it's just simple text like, hey, hope you're having a great day, just want to let you know, like, I love you, can go a long way for a lot of individuals. Removing them from a stressful situation can sometimes be helpful, though this could lead to escape. So I'm always hesitant with this one, but just know that sometimes if you're like in a loud, crowded place that you know they might find overwhelming, maybe voicing them like, hey, why don't we go over here? It seems a little quieter, right? That can be helpful. If you see them shutting down, remove them maybe. So if you know that they're going to shut down, and shutting down usually leads to like, I don't know, maybe a screaming fit, right? And that embarrasses them, and then their anxiety increases, right? Maybe saying like, hey, let's go take a walk right now, or let's go for a drive right now, right? But then coming back to where they were at, right, if possible. So we're not building up that escape like, oh, mom's gonna notice if I start to act this way, and then she'll just pull me out so that way I don't have to be at church every single Sunday now, right? Be predictable. This can be really helpful. So a lot of times, right, the more predictable we are, the less anxiety others will have, or our loved ones will have. Make plans, but give an out, right? So a lot of times individuals who experience anxiety want to attend things and they want to be invited, but a lot of times we stop inviting them because they keep telling us no, right? So still keep inviting them, but you can give them a note like, hey, we're all going bowling Friday, don't know if you're busy, right? So there's the out, but we'd love if you'd come with us, right? So we're showing God's love, we're showing that we care about them, right? Versus like, well, I'm not gonna call Bill because every time I call Bill to go bowling, Bill never wants to go bowling with me, right? Maybe Bill doesn't like bowling, but it's sometimes just inviting them and then not being invited after a while can make people feel like, oh, I must be a burden on these individuals because they stop calling me. Okay? Explain, plans in advance can always be helpful. Just ensuring that you're having communication with them is always a helpful thing. So make sure that you text back. And then help with little things. So maybe it's just like, you know, somebody's really stressed out and you go over there and you're like, hey, you need some help with some house chores today, right? Or, hey, I brought you a meal, or, hey, I brought you a coffee because I know you probably need a coffee. It's probably been pretty stressful for you lately. Here, I brought you a coffee, right? Little things like that can be a good way to support others. And then talking about anxiety, so self-sharing. So this one's different than what we've been talking about, right? So we've been talking about ways that we can support others. But now, let's say you have anxiety and you want to share and you're not sure how to share that you have anxiety. So I recommend planning ahead and writing down what you want to say. That can be really helpful. It kind of gives you an idea, and that way your anxiety is not taking full control of your brain in that anxious moment when you're sharing, right? It could even be just a letter. One of the individuals that I work with wanted to let his parents know that he felt he had anxiety, so he went ahead and he wrote a letter and just gave it to his parents. It was too anxiety-provoking to share with his parents, so he wrote them a letter. I thought that was a great idea. It didn't come from me. It was kind of his own thing of, I can't talk about this, so I'm just going to write a letter and I'm going to give it to them. And I thought that was great. And his parents' response was fantastic as well, too. But yes, sometimes planning ahead. Pick a good time and place, right? So if the person is busy doing something, like they just told you, hey, I have to meet this deadline, it's due in an hour, not going to their office and be like, oh, by the way, guess what? I have anxiety. Because their response is probably going to be like, I really want to support you, but I got a deadline to meet, right? So we want to plan in advance. If you're possible, right? So pick a good time and place. Prepare for possible reactions, right? Some people you might get, if you share your anxiety, oh, it's all in your head. Or you must not be praying enough because God takes away all of our anxiety, right? So, which is not true, believe me. But I'm telling you, that might be a possible reaction, right? So be prepared for those possible reactions by sharing. And then be prepared to share what you need, right? So oftentimes when we do share that we're anxious, we don't always think about sharing what we need, but people want to know, right? So if you don't like hugs, tell them, when I feel anxious, just don't hug me, okay? I don't need a hug right now. Right? But I do need this. Like, you can support me in this way by just checking up on me, sending me a text, right? Explaining what anxiety feels like for you. Anxiety feels different for everybody, right? There's, if you Google anxiety symptoms, you're going to see like a 10-page list of different symptoms that people feel. People often feel different symptoms, so explaining it to them, what you feel like doing when you feel anxious, all those kinds of things, okay? Explain how it affects you as well. And then if you need to, seek help, right? Ask them to help you find somebody to work with you. But it's tough. Sharing your anxiety is tough, right? I think it's hard to tell people that maybe we aren't perfect, right? But as Christians, right, we should already know we're not perfect beings, right? That's why Jesus died on the cross and experienced immense anxiety for us prior to being crucified, right? Because we're not perfect. And so it's okay to admit you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. Okay. And I didn't switch up here, my apologies. So I just have some last closing thoughts there. So we're all unique. Our interactions, right, with others will be individualized. So some people might like hugs, some people might not. Some people might want to be immersed in the Bible with you, and some people might just like that you're praying for them, right? And seek help, obviously, from a licensed professional or other treatment if you feel you need it, or you can suggest that to a loved one. As Matthew noted, right, it's not unbiblical for us to seek help, right? It's when it starts to keep us from God, then maybe we need to start looking at it. But it's okay to use our brains and the things that God has given us, the talents God has given many people, right, to assist us. So, questions? Sorry, I kept you guys all a little bit longer than I planned to. No? All right. Yes?
I'm anxious because I don't know how to ask this.
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay, how, some of the symptoms we talk about is anxiety, anxious about a test, probably because you procrastinated. Some of this is related to ADD.
Possibly.
Possibly.
Yeah.
It could be.
Okay.
How do you deal with that? Is that procrastination is an issue, it's got to be dealt with, so they don't procrastinate. You don't procrastinate, you're less anxious.
Right. So, yes. Yes, you may.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of research lately on procrastination, and not the fact that you're lazy or that maybe there's an organizational issue, but there's also a lot about procrastination and the fact that you are avoiding the unwanted feelings you have by dealing with it. So you don't feel confident about your math test. So you're going to feel less than, you're going to feel stupid maybe, so you're going to procrastinate on studying for that math test and just perpetuate that problem. So in that moment of feeling anxious about the test, using those coping skills in the moment, but also understanding maybe I'm procrastinating because I'm feeling this way and looking at that. And it's true, ADHD, anxiety, all those different things can coexist and be messy. But really then looking at beforehand what it is to then cope with it. Sometimes it gets stuck in the idea of like, I need a diagnosis and I need an answer, as opposed to like, it could be
And I'll add to that because that was a great answer. In the behavioral world, we don't look at diagnosis. So yes, a diagnosis is helpful in the sense of it gives us an understanding of like somebody's functioning level. So I know like I'm not going to necessarily maybe give somebody on my caseload based on their diagnosis a huge 200-page book on anxiety, right? But I might give it to somebody who I know is a doctor, right? Who's going to be able to read through all that and understand all that. What we're looking at in behavior, so in that aspect, a diagnosis is okay to help us plan, but what we really should be looking at is looking at also the function, right, of the behavior. So exactly what you're saying. So like, what is the function of why we're procrastinating? And then what are the tools that we can use? Maybe it's the skill set that we haven't built up before, right? So now we need to use that. So maybe we need to work on time management skills. Maybe we need to look at building in a schedule. Maybe we've been schedule averse, right? So trying out a schedule, so building those kinds of skills to help us address the function of why we're doing or engaging in the behavior. And I didn't get a lot into that today because I wanted to kind of just talk about the tools that you have and things, the way to approach others. Whereas the last talk I did, I talked a lot more about that, the function and things like that, because it's really important when trying to address your own anxiety and in working with professionals. So, yeah. And things you can do yourself too, but yeah. So self-management. But great question, I appreciate it. Well, any more questions? Otherwise, you guys are free to go. I've kept you like almost way past, but it's pretty good on time. Thank you all for coming. Just a reminder, so tonight, if you're interested, Matthew and I are going to be doing a little bit of a Q&A. Matthew's done these. I have not done one of these before with him, but he has done these.